to our next speaker, Dr. Jessica Frazier. Dr. Frazier is a university research lecturer teaching for the theology and religion faculty on Hinduism and theories of religion, and also for the philosophy faculty on Indian philosophy. Her research explores key philosophical themes across cultures, from Indian classical theories of being to 20th century phenomenology. Her books, such as Hindu Worldviews, Reality, Religion and Passion, Indian and Western Approaches in Hans-Georg Gadamer and Rupa Goswami, explore conceptions of reality, the self, and the good across cultures, focusing on classical Indian metaphysics and German phenomenology. And her forthcoming books explore Indian approaches to being, definitions of the material and the divine, and Gadamer's distinctive hermeneutic ontology. Jessica is also the managing editor of the Journal for Hindu Studies, Her work on Hindu ideas translates them into global terms, so we can all think in new ways about issues that shape our society, the nature of the good life, justice and human rights, metaphysics, and the goals of community. So Jessica anchors these perspectives in classical texts and brings them into conversation with academic philosophy and existential concerns. So Jessica is a philosopher who thinks through texts and reads the ancient material through the lens of contemporary philosophical concerns. And I think this work is not unlike Pierre Hadot, who does the same kind of thing, reads ancient texts in the light of contemporary philosophical concerns. And she's been instrumental in bringing Indian philosophy into the philosophy faculty at Oxford, which is no mean feat in my view, and now teaches a paper on Indian philosophy in the philosophy faculty. But today she's going to speak on Gadamer and the implications of his thinking with a lecture entitled Gadamer's Orchard, Phenomenology and the Role of Religious Studies in the Destiny of Humanity. So on that grand topic, over to you, Jessica.
Thank you, Gavin. So hopefully I can be heard and I can be seen and all those things are working properly. Thank you so much for the opportunity to discuss. I always love to talk about Gadamer, although I often see him as outside of the more, let's say, French tradition. I think that in some ways very different things are going on, and I want to talk about that today. It's been wonderful hearing the papers that I heard earlier. I really appreciated the view of Otto. I really appreciated this view of love. And it's made me think more about what about the private, the hidden in human experience? What about the numinous and the inarticulate in human experience? I love the idea of the ideogrammatic grammar of human experience, taking inarticulate experiences and putting them into language. So this has been really helpful at kind of expanding my thoughts about Gadamer, actually, which have been sitting there a long time. What I want to do here, though, in some ways following on from the themes that we just heard about, I think here also generativity and humanity's place in generativity, opening to transcendence, opening to growth and flourishing, are very much kind of themes that I think that Gadamer brings out in his phenomenology, and I want to bring that in. And maybe I also want to, I'm setting this up a little bit as a kind of a thinking board that we can push over later. But in some ways, I think coming out of his own German tradition, and I'm going to talk a lot about Hegel, he's got a different angle on what phenomenology is supposed to do. His essays on the history and what he sees as being the purpose of phenomenology are interesting in that way. And maybe where I think French existentialism and phenomenology both are looking at ontology, being, consciousness as something that's with the purpose of serving human experience to a large extent. That's something more personal, more subjective, more person-centered in that tradition that flows all the way from Descartes, who's looking inward. I think that Gadamer comes out of a tradition that is more Bohmian, it's more Spinozist, it's more Hegelian, it's Schlegelian, and its putting humans at the service of being, not being at the service of human experience and life, but human life and experience at the service of being. And in a way, I think that's where he's going with it. He has a different kind of existential concern. I think he wants to serve history rather than serve humanity in a certain kind. It's an odd thing to say, because of course he's known for being concerned with ethics, dialogue, the unfolding of the conditions for kind of ethical and respectful community. So I'm angling in a certain direction to try and make the point, but I think that distinction maybe is there. I'm going to share screen just so I can put up some of the texts that I think are kind of interesting and sometimes even inspiring to see. So let's share. And if I pull this up and slideshow, I haven't used Zoom for like 3-4 months, so it's completely mysterious to me. I can't believe we lived on this for like a year, but here we go. Okay, so Hans-Georg Gadamer has a fascination with biological imagery of fruiting, of nature. A lot of the poetry that he prefers, and I think if you read his biographical work and you read a lot of his later essays, you see what kind of aesthetic, if you like, is informing him. He talks constantly about growing up in groups of poetry readers, young men and women in little reading groups in Breslau, and they felt that it was a new open way of interacting. It was gender equal, it was religion equally, talked about it being, you know, Jewish students as well as Christian students, as well as atheist and humanist students. So for him, the poetic, the artistic, and the whole aesthetic of a kind of a beauty, creativity, and flourishing, informed way of living was really important to him and what he's thinking about. I think it's important to see what kind of metaphors, images, and ethos is informing these different phenomenologists, because they're often putting their analysis to work in very personal ways. And for him, this is important in its own curious way. I kind of want to raise this question: what are the goals of phenomenology? And maybe suggest that where other phenomenologists place ontology in the service of human life, does Gadamer, perhaps following the tradition of Hegel, Boehme, Spinoza, and others, place human life at the service of ontology? Is looking within us, in some sense, and within is a complicated word, but is in looking within us meant to get to the essence of the human, right? That being in time has that sense in which it still seems to be mapping out a very specifically human set of concerns, or is it meant to be something that addresses a larger concern? Think of his fascination with Plato, who Plato is in illuminating the human, but he also wants to get us to this other realm. Anselm is looking inward to the house inside the soul, I think it's the Prosologion, but he expects to find God there. Descartes is doing his meditations not just to find himself inside, of course, but to find something else. Gavin's, I think of You're the Truth Within, Gavin reminded me of how much looking inward is looking inward onto a window through which you see what is outward. So when is it looking in and when is it looking out? Now, Gadamer, I'm going to focus on this metaphor that Gadamer gets from Hegel's Phenomenology of Spirit. Gadamer gave special attention to a brief use of a metaphor in Hegel's Phenomenology, which talks about natural growth from a tree. And in this metaphor I'm going to give you in a second, Hegel seems to be looking for a way to express the being embedded, form encompassed, vitalistic, and constantly opening up place that consciousness has in the cosmos. In the preface to the Phenomenology of Spirit, Hegel begins by setting out the way that philosophy has to do more than simply see reality, more than simply present it, copy and present it, which sometimes phenomenology seems to do, and more than just analyze it condensed to its essences, the kind of Kantian project. It's supposed to do more than that with each particular instance of its existence. Philosophy is supposed to contribute. It's supposed to help create. It has an explicitly generative character. And a quote that you find in that preface: the ordinary mind does not conceive the diversity of philosophical systems, So thinking now about what we as phenomenology of religion or philosophers of history scholars do when we look at these many different possible uses of the mind, if you like. The ordinary mind does not conceive the diversity of these philosophical systems as the progressive evolution of truth. It sees only contradiction in that variety. But Hegel wants to tell us this is wrong. The philosopher's mind can see better. He says the bud disappears when the blossom breaks through. And we might say that the former is refuted by the latter. In the same way, when the fruit comes, the blossom may be explained to have been just a false form of the plant's existence, for the fruit now appears as its true nature in place of the blossom. These stages are not merely differentiated, they supplant one another as being incompatible with one another. When I read this, I always think of the people who would take up, for instance, religious studies. I had a friend who was very Christian, and he took up the study of Islam, and it blew his mind, and he just had to give up the course. He nearly gave up his whole degree, because supplanting effectively, phenomenologically, in the sense of taking it, letting it show itself as it is, was in danger of killing. It was the fruit that was killing the blossom of his own thought. And so he decided to keep the blossom, right? So that sense of supplanting often appears natural to people. But, says Hegel, that's not how it has to be. The ceaseless activity of their own inherent nature makes them at the same time moments of an organic unity, where they not merely do not contradict each other, but where one is as necessary as the other. And this equal necessity of all moments constitutes alone, and thereby, the life of the whole. So we've got that Hegelian thing, which is all about the whole. It's all about dynamism. It's all about holism in the sense of incorporating the parts. And this is the metaphor of the girl in the garden that Hegel goes on to. This is at the first, what I just read was at the very beginning of the Phenomenology of Spirit. This is in the very last chapter, more or less, the revealed religion. And Gadamer takes this quote and reproduces it whole in Truth and Method. Hegel goes on, so just as the girl who presents the plucked fruit is more than nature that presented it in the first place, with all of its conditions and elements, trees, air, light, and so on, insofar as she combines all these in a higher way, in the light of self-consciousness, in her eyes and in her gestures, so also the spirit of destiny, which gives us these works of art, is the spirit of tragic fate that gathers all these individual gods and attributes of substance within one pantheon, into spirit conscious of itself as spirit. Hegel's here building, in a sense, he's mapping being. He's mapping, you call it history, call it existence, call it the totality of forms, the totality of experiences, language in its actual and potential, nature, its being. And he's mapping it into almost stages, right? So we've got the elements, we've got the tree, which combines them. We've got the girl, who in a sense is the product of she wouldn't exist without the fruit and the food that it creates, but who also combines them in a new way. And that notion of emergence always comes up because she combines them in self-consciousness, a different kind of material with a different kind of unity. And from self-consciousness comes, further than that, art. And art, he says, in a sense, is part of this. So Gadamer builds on this, and he wants to show us that that art, that culture, that ideas are just the fruit on the tree of being. Now, in the Phenomenology of Spirit, Hegel goes on to speak of man's hunger for life and ecstasy and ferment and enthusiasm. And one can see why Gadamer was so keen to defend Hegel against his own peers who often denigrated him. He felt that the rationalist reception of Hegel had him wrong, that Heidegger's dismissal of Hegel as well as Plato was all wrong-minded. Hegel had said actually much more of what Heidegger wanted to say than he realized. And he felt that for Hegel, a view of the unfolding, living, contemporary, future-directed, in that sense, vertical, maybe certainly generative, outward-directed, dynamic growth of the world is necessary. And this is contributed to by the thinker who sees via a kind of hermeneutic awareness. That person can best add to being via sublation, combining it all together into something higher, rather than merely imitating, repeating the past, or merely reacting to it. So understanding helps spirit's dialectic itself make progress. It's not just about us, it's about spirit. And Hegel goes on. I'm not going to read this quote actually because it'll take a while, but the imagery of the natural comes back again and again. The oak grows, and if we ask to see an oak, just an acorn won't work. We should be seeing the whole rich, complex being of the oak tree. That's what the scholar, in a sense, is doing. Now, Gadamer, just to pull back to what Gadamer is trying to do and to see the place of that ethics in his work, he puts together Truth and Method in 1960 after 15 years of working in German universities after the war, where because he wasn't as Nazi as the others, whatever that means, he was brought in Eastern Germany and then later in Western Germany as someone who could heal the university. And a large part of that was about increasing inclusion of people. So Truth and Method has that in the background of the writing. And he has this wonderful epigraph from Rilke that talks about playing with the ball by yourself. Isn't that exciting? But when you're suddenly the catcher of a ball thrown by a partner, note it's an eternal partner, why catching then becomes a power, not yours, a world's. Again, that shift from the individual towards the world itself. So he kind of has his own utopian vision being expressed here, that's written as a kind of a post-war, post-national socialism, post-communist, globalist response to the grand philosophies that had gone before. He's been fighting in a sense the influence of National Socialism, and then he's in intensely communist universities. And when globalism comes along, the 60s, the 70s, and the 80s, he's really prolific. Also his 80s, of course, because he's born in 1900. He's really excited because this is giving him, at last, the kind of place that he's comfortable to be. And he starts to write in response to the increasing communications and media. That's in the sense that for us now, that's computing, revolution. He's very concerned with nuclear power. We forget about that now, but that was a major push to trying to think more globally. Migration, he's aware of. He's really interested in the move toward Esperanto, if anyone remembers the movement to create a European language. And he actually wrote against that. He said, we ought to go ahead and learn other people's languages. And he was a bit of a bitch to Derrida at times, because Derrida couldn't speak many of the languages, but Gadamer was rather proud of his French and saw himself as this more kind of international erudite figure. And he was excited to travel when the time came that he could do this, even though he was very old at that time. So he's interested in a new world, and he saw this new modernity as continuous with his own upbringing. He talked about Breslau, where he spent a large part of his youth, as this very cosmopolitan city. It was the first place to get electric lights. It had a Jewish university near the Catholic university, so it had both these different centers of cultural learning. It also had plenty of humanistic stuff. His father was a humanist, biologist, his mother a German kind of mysto-pietist, really. And he felt that all that fitted together in a brilliant way. His first wife, was older than him and part of a family of erudite published women. So he felt it was very gender positive. So he saw himself as kind of fitting into that world, and contrasts this with Heidegger, who there's this weird power dynamic, as you know. Heidegger looks down on Gadamer. Gadamer's quiet and shy about it, but secretly thinks Heidegger's a bit of a hick. And a fascist, which that part didn't quite get wrong. So anyway, Gadamer thinks he's bringing out something like the Vatican II of phenomenological perspectives. Oops, down. And Gadamer wants to sort of express that. So in his later works, like The Enigma of Health, lots of essays on health, on education, on languages, and on arts. He says, my own deepest hope, or perhaps I should say my dream, is that from the shared inheritance which is gradually being built up for us from all the different human cultures across the globe, we might eventually learn how to recognize our needs and address our difficulties through becoming explicitly conscious of them. He saw globalization, and by that, let me rephrase that. Globalization is the taking over of one culture. Globalism, if you like, if we take that as the existence of a shared culture, in which ideally there's increasingly an equal participation, he thought that's great. It's a natural expression of what's needed and of the principles of language, which for him are the principles of consciousness and human experience he's been seeing all his life. He sees it as an expression of Bildung. So in many ways, he adapts von Humboldt's Bildung, so the building of character, which is at the center of the German concept of education, as Geist as Wissenschaft, the wisdom of spirit. If Humboldt's Bildung was ostensibly more moral and person-directed, it's informed by Goethe and Schiller and all the German thinkers who are interested in the individual spirit pursuing its destiny and improving itself. So he says, when in our language we say Bildung, we mean something both higher and more inward, namely the disposition of mind, which from the knowledge and the feeling of the total intellectual and moral endeavor, flow harmoniously into sensibility and character. So that drive towards sensibility and character is there, and the sense in which Bildung was always a vertically directed phenomenon. It's always the idea that a soul is an unformed thing, basically made of potential, that has to be, it's its nature to be built upwards. It's a waste of a resource to leave it as it is, like leaving a plant to rot on a windowsill. And it has certain natural trajectories that are to do predominantly with consciousness and its ability to understand, to refine, to create. So a lot of that verticality is already there, even before we get phenomenological or theological. But Gadamer carried forward its more spiritual destiny of humanity in the cosmos aspects. He says, the rise of the word Bildung evokes the ancient mystical tradition, according to which man carries in his soul the image of God after whom he is fashioned, and which man must cultivate in himself. Bildung is not achieved in the manner of a technical construction, but grows out of an inner process of formation and cultivation, and therefore constantly remains in a state of inner Bildung. It is not accidental that in this respect, the word Bildung resembles the Greek physis. He sets up for himself a problem that's going to remain throughout his work, which is that Bildung's already happening. Development and verticality and growth are already happening. You know, in a sense, phenomenology's, the consciousness's work is already happening. What does it mean to add to it? What does it do for the individual, for the self, and what does it actually consist of? But you can see that you can see that between the Greeks and a kind of a Hegelian and a kind of a German pietist, Burmean pantheist way of thinking, all those things are mixed in with him, even though he sees himself as essentially non-religious. Now, crucially to this, in some ways what I want to do is show how for Gadamer, not so much phenomenological theology or theological phenomenology, not so much those, but rather something more like religious studies, old phenomenology of religion as it's meant in just the study of religions, as it were, for him is a really important part of the growth of spirit. So Gadamer's idea is that things which have otherness or unfamiliarity are of most value. They expand. Sciences of understanding what is unfamiliar or incomprehensible are essential to this development. We see this, and I won't go into the kind of details of his phenomenology, I'm sure you know it, but the hermeneutic circle, the fusion of horizons, are all about principles by which actually growth happens in every event of understanding. And for Gadamer, every event is understanding, but some are kind of bigger than others. And it's that bigness and that forward movement that he wants to increase. So he says practical Bildung includes overcoming the element in it that is alien to the particularity that is oneself and making it wholly one's own. He said this in response to the big debate he had with Derrida in 81, 84, where Derrida said, Monsieur le Gadamer, c'est stupide ce que tu dis, I'm not interested, you don't understand me, I'm more cool, more radical, go to bed, old man. I paraphrase, obviously. And Gadamer essentially said, you say that I can't understand you, but you talk to me. In telling me you can't understand me, you're hoping for a development of some kind. That is what this is about. And he says, we agree on everything. It's just that I think that the unsaid, the unsayable, the challenging is all about growth, that nothing in the end goes nowhere. It's always still feeding back into and building consciousness. So he's interested in opposing views and differing assumptions. And he also terms this theoretical Bildung, following Hegel. He says to have a theoretical stance is, as such, already alienation, namely the demand that one deal with something that is not immediate, something that is alien, with something that belongs to memory and to thought. Theoretical Bildung leads beyond what man knows and experiences immediately. It consists in learning to affirm what is different from oneself and to find universal viewpoints from which one can grasp the thing, the objective thing in its freedom, without selfish interest. This paragraph is always kind of reassuring to me, because it means I don't have to go out and talk to somebody else. I can read, give me a wacky text. I can read the Nature Sutra, Gavin and Bjarne's specialty, which is really bizarre at first when you try and read it. I can read it, not understand it, and already in myself, I'm having a conversation and I'm developing theory. I'm building forward and outward. The theory I build will turn out to be wrong. I'll have to keep change. I'm now dialoguing with the material and the theory. I develop a new theory. The dialectic is working and moving onward. And it's making me less selfish if I do it right. And Gadamer notes from this, it can be enough to just go study the Greeks. For Gadamer, the Greeks are another culture. They're foreign. They're not supposed to be the roots of Western philosophy. They're actually weirder and differenter, as then they're generally portrayed as being. And that's right, he says, that's how it should be. If we don't look at Plato as really different, having a different religion from us, a different culture, we're misunderstanding him. So just a few more things. He continues this theme. For him, that study of other cultures is essential. To recognize one's own and the alien, to become at home in it, is the basic movement of spirit. And its being consists only in returning to itself from what is other. Right, so this is really important. All other theoretical Bildung, even acquiring foreign languages and conceptual worlds, explicitly foreign languages and conceptual worlds, that's what a lot of us do, is merely the continuation of a process of Bildung. It's not so much the anthropology of human life that is supposed to be revealed by hermeneutics as phenomenology. It's the ontology. It's the ontology of being's material, its texture, expanse, and possibilities that is revealed by hermeneutics as phenomenology, right? So it's the anthropology of being. And I think that shift is really important for him. He says, we do not require a naive recognition in which our own world is merely reproduced for us in a timelessly valid form. On the contrary, we're self-consciously aware of both our own great historical tradition as a whole, and in their otherness, even forms and traditions of quite different cultural worlds that have not fundamentally affected Western history. We can thereby appropriate them for ourselves. And the word appropriate, that's always a bad quote, because the word appropriate has come to mean something else. But I think what he wants to say about appropriate is when you take another idea, even a person who you've met who says things you don't expect, they're assimilated into you. We are growing and change. The fabric, the flesh, if you like, is changing. Flesh of being and our own. So really, globalism is a kind of phenomenological tool. We are all others and we are all our own selves. That sense in which the self is this liminal being. The self is Heidegger's image of a ursprünglich, of a well that is constantly emanating, but from an underground spring we do not know, and which constantly spreads outwards, is in a sense a kind of a Gadamerian image of the self. That comes out in his work on Paul Celan, his beautiful set of essays called, I think, The Breath Gadamer on Celan, I think it's called The Breath Crystal, where he talks about the human as a well of breath. We're constantly bringing out this rich, fecund, biological, moist reality. And we can turn it into language, and that language into ideas at any given moment. So we are that well, but we don't really know what's inside fully. I think that's interesting and important point. And Professor Sawai's discussion of Otto was really interesting to me, because it brings out that sense in which, is there a kind of an inner access to the numinous in Gadamer? Is there a hidden object from which it emerges? He loves Rilke's angels. There's always a symbol of the mystery, I think, for both Heidegger and Gadamer. But he's cautious about how he expresses it. Nevertheless, both at the center, and he talks a lot about Augustine in this connection as well, kind of the inner word, and at the horizons, which are always fusing and moving outwards, there's a kind of an indeterminacy that we're always grasping, always aware of, that factors into even our determinate knowledge. So we're all others and we're all our own selves. And also the coexistence of different cultures and languages, religions and confessions supports us. It's explicitly kind of complex religion positive, it's explicitly multiculturalist. We all as humans and as peoples and as nations break the laws of such existence infinitely often. And yet in actual life, with the goodwill of partners, something common is always rebuilt. So we're always going back to the determinate, the closed, but we have to open again. In general, this appears to me to be the same task everywhere. And it appears to me that here, the diversity of languages, this neighborhood of the other in a narrow space, and the equality of the other in an even narrower space, and he's talking about migration debates here, is actually very kind of on message for a 2021 situation. He says all of this, what is it? Is it problem? Is it conflict? He says it's a training ground. And again, a training ground, not just for the human, but I think for being. That's from an essay called The Diversity of Europe, Inheritance and Future, which he probably, if he was around, wishes people would read more. So basically, to kind of pull that together, I want to show that the sense in which that phenomenology scholars and phenomenology of religion scholars actually are the fruit of the tree of being. They're the ones who are pulling up matter into life and turning life into consciousness and turning consciousness into comprehension, comprehension into ideas, ideas into culture, culture into living onward creativity that opens up possibilities. In The Idea of the University, Yesterday, Today, and Tomorrow, he writes, there is this chain of generations which pass through an institution like the university, in which teachers and students meet and lose one another. Students become teachers, and from the activity of the teachers grows a new teaching, a living universe. That's what we're really doing. I think the small academic universe still remains one of the few precursors of the grand universe of humanity, of all human beings, who must learn to create with one another new solidarities. So, finally, last slide. What would that mean? So in some ways, I'm just setting out, I think, Gadamer's, the way, I haven't gone into the hermeneutic phenomenology minutiae of his analysis. Many of you will know it already. But what he sees to be the case about the fundamental nature of consciousness as an unfolding of concepts that he calls language has these huge implications for our nature, for, if you like, our destiny within being. What would be the future direction for us and for being? Well, the first message is that the directions for us, the future for us is the future for being. There might be other futures for being happening far away, in crystalline structures on Mars or something, but this is one of the futures for being that's happening here through consciousness. And one message is that making more being at the horizon as things unfold in modernity is a good thing. We should make more being. That's, in a sense, the way that we do vertical. It is creativity, and I think it's a self-aware creativity. For Gadamer, he expresses this through his extensive writing and his personal focus on the arts. But he's clear in his writing about the university, about education, that that's also a really central part of it. and even travel, cultural study, encounters with the other. Travel is glamorous. Migration, immigration within a single existing country is not seen as glamorous. But I think for him, both are part of the journey of spirit. He also perhaps might have reminded us in some of his work that we should look inward to the unarticulate, the inexpressible, the barely experiential. What are the parts that do not come out in language and dialogue, even in theory? He looked at this through poetry. As I said, he's interested in using Celan and Rilke as ways of thinking through what hasn't been said and what the place of the nonverbal is. He doesn't say much about the bodily, the emotional, and other modes of experience. And I think that's been a criticism of him often. I think that's because the way that he conceives of quote unquote language is actually as any kind of formed conscious experience. But it also means perhaps that he hasn't given as much focus on other modes, if you like, of being. And that would be a really good way forward. It's also probably true, and this has been suggested, that he doesn't give as much theorizing and attention to the private world. Private dialogue's own dynamics are unclear. We just saw him talk about theoretical Bildung happening within, the dialogue of ideas within us that we struggle with. That's an essential part of being. But maybe there are other aspects of what that private world is, the parts that still don't find themselves in theory. They find themselves in the messy, the mushy, the dark and untheorized. It'd be interesting to see where to take that. And I think as well, the mystical. Gadamer says explicitly he says, I don't believe in God. Is that true? He says, I don't like churches. I don't believe in heaven. I think he explicitly says, I'm not sure about the immortality of the soul. He gives a list of things in various different places that he says, no, it wasn't really my thing. He hates the church organ. He thinks it's just the most horrible instrument ever that would kill your faith in a second. The greatest mystic would be killed by having to sit through a church service. But he also says, he and his father both, his father, the time a famous chemist, actually, he said, they both said, well, it's not that biology contradicts the existence of God. He says, totally possible. And he's coming from a German vitalist tradition where it's actually not unusual to see biology's unfolding and religion as going together, in a sense, confirming each other. For him, there's a lot of that going on. But I think the other forms of the mystical he's curious about, but it's not clear where they would sit in a Gadamerian world. Really, for him, the mystical is immersion in being and its unfolding. And that's why he has this wonderful reference to a poem. When he addresses the Stephen George Poetry Society, he makes reference to Tattvamasi, the Sanskrit term, you are that. And he says, this is what poetry and the arts help us do. They help us to immerse ourselves in the unfolding beauty of this strange phenomenon. So for him, the mystical is that. I think there are still these different areas in and around the orchard that he sees us as all as being in, and they wait to be addressed. But I do think it's an interesting idea that the verticality of being is actually already embedded in what we do when we understand other cultures. It's part of a much larger destiny for humanity in which we serve something larger. I'm going to stop there and turn over back to you.